No one inside that towering courtroom could have predicted what was about to unfold. The air was heavy, not with silence, but with anticipation that felt almost violent, like the hum before a storm. At the center of it all sat Justice Samuel Alito, his robe draped like armor, his lips curled into a smug half-smirk that carried both contempt and confidence. He leaned back in his high chair as if gravity itself bowed to his presence. Left, clerks shuffled papers. To his right, colleagues masked boredom with stern facades. And directly before him stood the figure who had captured the room's tension like a live wire, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She didn't move with the timidity of someone entering hostile ground. No, she carried herself like a fighter who had waited her whole life for this moment, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp enough to cut marble. The courtroom has spoken. But now it's your turn. We've witnessed truth rising above arrogance now. We want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments below and let the world see how justice resonates across borders. Every name, every place, is a reminder that courage and principle matter everywhere. Don't just watch, be part of this moment. The stakes were unspoken but undeniable. This was not just a hearing. This was not just about a single dispute or a headline for tomorrow's paper. What hung in the balance was trust the fragile. Battered trust that millions of Americans placed in the law, in the courts, in the very foundation of democracy. Alito, long seen by critics as untouchable, had already decided this was his arena, his play. To him, Crockett was an outsider, a mere politician daring to confront the judiciary's empire. He had smirked before she even said a word, signaling to the chamber that he had already won the battle before it began. Now, smirk was his weapon, his dismissal, his prophecy. But if Alito thought that smirk could crush her spirit, he miscalculated. Badly, the audience in the gallery leaned forward, restless. Reporters tapped notes furiously, their eyes flicking between the justice's smugness and Crockett's piercing stillness. Among them were activists, lawyers, students, some skeptical, some desperate for proof that someone, anyone, could pierce the armor of judicial arrogance. And then there were the cameras. Though the Supreme Court was rarely this exposed, special permission had been granted for a live broadcast of this oversight hearing. Millions watched from living rooms, coffee shops, and offices. The weight of the nation's gaze pressing down on every second. Crockett's personal stakes were far deeper than what the audience saw. For her, this wasn't a career stunt or a chance to trend online. She had lived under laws crafted by men who sneered at women like her. She had practiced law in courtrooms where judges assumed her sharp tongue was disrespect rather than rigor. She had been underestimated, ignored, and mocked. Not because of lack of talent, but because her very existence disrupted the script. Now, she stood not only for herself, but for every American who had ever felt the system tilt against them. To lose, here to falter, or be silenced by Alito's disdain would not just humiliate her. It would reinforce the lie that power could not be challenged, that smirks could drown out truth. Alito, sensing the drama, leaned forward slightly, his eyes glinting like a man preparing to toy with prey. His voice carried the rehearsed calm of someone who believed he owned the room. "Congresswoman," he began, stretching her title just enough to make it sound like mockery, "you may proceed. Though I'll warn you now, this is not the place for theatrics. The law does not bend to passion." His words fell like a hammer, a preemptive strike meant to cage her before she spoke. His smirk deepened. He believed this was already over. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some in the gallery nodded in agreement with Alito, others tightened their jaws. The divide was palpable, like watching two tectonic plates grind against each other. Crockett took a single step forward, her heels echoing against the polished floor, a sound so sharp it sliced through the silence. She didn't blink at Alito's warning. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though cataloging his arrogance for later use. She placed her hand on the podium, fingers steady, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. The silence grew louder than words, swelling into something almost unbearable. People exchanged glances. Reporters froze their pens mid-sentence. Alito shifted, annoyed, his smirk faltering just a fraction, and then With a voice that carried the precision of a scalpel, Crockett broke the silence. "Justice Alito," she said, enunciating his title not with reverence, but with razor-edged clarity. "What bends the law? More passion or prejudice?" The line hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some jaws dropped. Alito Smirks stiffened. Not gone, but tested. He hadn't expected the first blow to strike at the core of his persona. His eyes narrowed, calculating. Crockett's words weren't theatrics. They were a trap of their own, delivered with calm that suggested she knew exactly what game he was playing and had come prepared to rewrite the rules. The moment crystallized. Wasn't just a congresswoman versus a justice. It was a clash of worlds. Raw truth against institutional arrogance, lived experience against polished detachment, and for the first time in years, the aura of inevitability surrounding Alito flickered. In the back of the room, someone coughed nervously. A few whispered exchanges darted across the gallery. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, every beat of sweat, every flick of Alito's jaw. Across America, viewers sat forward, glued to the spectacle. And it wasn't just drama. It was history clawing its way out of marble walls and into living rooms. Crockett didn't rush. She knew the weight of pacing, the artistry of silence. Let the room feel the discomfort. Let Alito stew in the possibility that his smirk had already cost him the upper hand. Her calmness was not passivity. It was a declaration that she would not play by the tempo he'd set. Alito opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but stopped. Maybe he realized too late that responding quickly would validate her framing. Maybe he thought silence would salvage his superiority. But silence in this moment only amplified hers. She had tilted the room's balance without raising her voice, without presenting evidence, without pounding her fist. With one sentence, she had made the smirk look smaller, weaker, like a child's defense mechanism in a room full of adults. The gallery seemed to pulse. One clerk's pen dropped, echoing faintly. A student in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Reporter muttered under their breath, "She's not here to play." The air was no longer charged with Alito's control. It vibrated with the possibility that he had underestimated his opponent. And as Crockett finally leaned closer to the microphone, her lips parting with the hint of another strike, the atmosphere shifted again. It was as if the walls themselves braced for impact, because the moment she opened her mouth again, the entire courtroom would tilt in her favor, or collapse under the weight of what she was about to unleash. Judge Samuel Alito leaned back in, his chair, the faintest smirk, curving at the corner of his lips. He had waited for this moment, the moment he could put Jasmine Crockett in her place. The courtroom was thick with tension, cameras rolling, and journalists scribbling down notes with frantic energy. To the outside world, it was just another high-profile hearing. But inside, every look, every word carried weight that could define reputations forever. Alito adjusted his glasses and glanced at Crockett like a man about to toy with someone he believed inferior. His tone, when he finally spoke, dripped with calculated condescension. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, drawing out her title, as if it were a costume she didn't deserve to wear. "You stand here lecturing on constitutional values, but tell me, have you even read beyond the surface of the cases you so freely cite? Or are you simply parroting talking points fed to you by staffers?" Gasps rippled faintly from the observers in the back rows. It wasn't just a question, it was an attack on her intellect, her credibility, and even her right to stand on that stage. Alito wanted to frame her as unqualified, a fraud who didn't belong in the same room as him. His voice carried the kind of mockery designed not to elicit an answer, but to humiliate. He leaned further forward, eyes gleaming. "I've seen plenty of politicians wander into court thinking they can play lawyer. They usually leave embarrassed. So tell us, Congresswoman, are you here to enlighten us with legal wisdom, more just to give us a performance?" The words echoed, like a slap across the chamber. A few spectators chuckled under their breath, while others shifted uncomfortably. Alito's allies smirked, waiting for her to stumble. For a moment, silence hovered, daring her to react emotionally. Alito wanted her rattled, defensive, reduced to stammering under his gaze. He wanted to show the country that she was all style and no substance. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she let the pause linger, drawing the silence out until it grew sharp enough to cut. Her eyes never left Alito's, and her calm, steady demeanor turned the tables before she even opened her mouth. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, low enough to command attention, but strong enough to carry authority. "Justice Alito," she said, emphasizing justice as though reminding him of the title he risked dishonoring, "I don't need staffers to understand the Constitution. I don't need a script to know the law. I've lived it. I've practiced it, and unlike you, I haven't hidden behind lifetime tenure, while everyday Americans bear the cost of decisions that strip them of their rights." The smirk on Alito's face faltered just slightly, but it was enough for the audience to notice. Crockett seized on the moment. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his sarcasm with sarcasm. Instead, she wielded composure as a weapon. Every word cut cleaner than if she had shouted. "You question whether I've read the cases?" she continued. "I've not only read them, I've seen the consequences of them. When your rulings closed the courthouse doors on civil rights, plaintiffs, I saw the communities left without recourse. When you bent over backwards to protect corporations over people, I represented the workers who lost everything. And when you tried to lecture this country on morality while accepting favors from billionaires, I was out there reminding the people that no one, not even a justice, is above accountability." A sharp murmur spread through the room. Reporters lifted their pens higher, scribbling faster. Crockett hadn't just deflected his attack, she had turned his weapon back on him. Alito's attempt to make her look small was now making him look defensive, compromised, and even corrupt. His smirk hardened into a forced neutrality, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Alito tried to regain footing, forcing a chuckle. "That's a nice speech, Congresswoman, but rhetoric doesn't change the law. Facts do. And the fact is, this court doesn't operate on emotional appeals. It operates on precedent, on structure. Perhaps if you had studied more carefully, you'd know that." This time, Crockett didn't let him control the tempo. She leaned forward, her tone sharper, more deliberate. "You're absolutely right. Justice, facts matter, precedent matters. So let's talk facts. The fact is, your own words in Dobbsy, Jackson gutted 50 years of precedent. The fact is, you claim to defend the Constitution, but you cherry-pick history to suit your ideology. And the fact is, you sit here smirking at me, hoping to intimidate, while millions of Americans, women, minorities, workers live every day with the fallout of decisions that you justify with selective originalism." The air grew heavier. Alito blinked, and for a split second, it seemed as though he hadn't expected her to come armed with specifics. She wasn't speaking in slogan, she was dismantling his entire argument in real time. The observers could feel the shift, a subtle turning of the tide. A young law clerk in the gallery whispered, just loud enough to be caught by the microphones, "She's destroying him." Others began to murmur too, heads turning, eyes widening. As the power dynamic in the courtroom inverted itself, Alito, who had begun this exchange with smug dominance, now looked like the one fending off blows. And then Crockett delivered the line that hit hardest. "You ask me if I've read the cases? I ask you if you've read the Constitution, or if you've simply decided that your interpretation outweighs the will of the people who live under it." The room went utterly still. Even Alito, master of the smug retort, was silent for a beat. Too long, his smirk had fully vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped stare. Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she had placed him under the very microscope he intended to use on her. Alito straightened, dusting his robe, his fingers drumming faintly on the bench. He was preparing another strike, something harsher, something meant to reassert his power. He wasn't done yet. If anything, Crockett's composure had enraged him further. His next move would be even more aggressive. But the audience had already sensed the shift. They weren't laughing at his jokes anymore, weren't nodding along with his sarcasm. Their whispers carried a new energy admiration for Crockett's poise, awe at her sharp command of facts, anticipation for what she might unleash next. And just when it seemed the balance had been restored, Crockett tilted her head, eyes fixed on Alito like a challenge. Her calm smile was the final twist of the knife. It told everyone watching that she wasn't intimidated, that she was just getting started. The tension was electric. Every breath in the room held. Every pen paused mid-stroke. And then the narrator's voice seemed to echo through the scene. But that was just the beginning. What happened next changed everything. The air inside the chamber was already thick from Judge Samuel Alito's first barbed attack and Jasmine Crockett's razor-sharp counter. A murmur still lingered among the audience, as though people were whispering fragments of what they had just witnessed. Some leaned forward, sensing more fireworks. Others sat frozen, unsure if what they had just heard was the beginning of something much larger. Alito, however, was not the type of man to back down after his authority had been challenged, especially not by someone younger, fresher, and, in his eyes, undeserving of standing to with him. He leaned forward in his chair, the smirk. That had briefly faltered now, twisted into something darker. His eyes narrowed as he studied Crockett, as if she were a puzzle he was determined to dismantle piece by piece. And then he struck again, not with subtlety, but with blunt force. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone dripping with mock civility. "Forgive me if I sound harsh, but perhaps your inexperience is showing. You speak as if you're some expert on constitutional law, but the truth is you're a politician, not a scholar. Isn't it true that you're simply parroting talking points without a deep understanding of the very principles you claim to defend?" The words landed with weight. It wasn't just a critique of her argument. It was a surgical strike at her credibility, her qualifications, her right to even be in the room. Alito wanted her diminished before the audience. He wanted her painted as a fraud. His voice grew sharper, slicing the silence. "You studied law, yes, but practicing in court and interpreting the Constitution at the highest level are worlds apart. Isn't it convenient, Congresswoman? It's a cherry-pick outrage while lacking the grounding to comprehend the complexity of these issues?" A few gasps echoed through the chamber. Reporters scribbled faster, knowing headlines were being born with each sentence. Alito pressed harder, sensing his chance to retake control. "And let us not forget," he continued, his smirk returning, "you have a reputation for being theatrical in committee hearings. Tell me, are we to believe this performance of yours is anything more than a stunt to win applause from your base? Or will you admit that this right here, right now, is politics masquerading as principle?" The attack was brutal, personal, and intentional. The courtroom audience shifted uneasily, glancing between Crockett and Alito like spectators at a prize fight. The judge's strategy was clear. Strip away her composure. Force her into an emotional reaction. Expose her as a lightweight. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Instead, she inhaled slowly, her calm presence contrasting sharply with Alito's growing aggression. She let the silence stretch for a beat longer than expected, making every eye fix on her. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, steady, and devastatingly precise. "Justice Alito," she said, locking her gaze on him, "you mistake confidence for inexperience and passion for theatrics. I don't need to wear your robe to understand the Constitution. I need only to read it, respect it, and fight for the people it was written to protect. And let's be clear, if you think my background disqualifies me from calling out hypocrisy, then I must ask, does your position protect you from accountability?" The words landed like a sudden thunderclap. A ripple moved through the chamber. Continued building momentum, her tone sharpening like a blade. "You accuse me of parroting talking points, yet here you are repeating the same tired lines meant to silence dissent. You suggest that my arguments are political theater, but tell me, what's more theatrical than a justice who openly smirks when confronted with the truth? What's more performative than pretending impartiality while signaling bias for all to see?" Alito shifted in his seat. It wasn't a large movement, but the kind of subtle fidget that betrayed discomfort. Crockett pressed forward, her voice gaining power. "And as for scholarship, justice, let me remind you that the Constitution doesn't belong exclusively to the bench or the bar. It belongs to the people. Every citizen has the right to question its guardians, especially when those guardians appear to forget that they serve the public, not themselves." The chamber fell so quiet that even the faint scratch of a pen could be heard. Words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a reframing of the entire conflict. Alito had tried to paint her as unqualified. She had turned it into a question of his accountability. Then she delivered the blow that shifted the atmosphere completely. You say I'm theatrical? Maybe so. But if speaking truth to power looks like a performance, then perhaps the real problem isn't my delivery, it's the uncomfortable reality of the truth itself. If that truth makes you smirk, Justice, then I wonder what part of your duty you're laughing at, the law or the people it's supposed to serve. Gasps rippled across the audience. Some in the gallery actually clapped before quickly catching themselves, silenced by the solemnity of the setting. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even a few clerks at the side of the chamber glanced nervously at Alito, unsure of how he would respond. For the first time, the judge's smirk flickered. His jaw tightened. He leaned back, as if attempting to regain composure, but his eyes betrayed a flash of anger. He hadn't expected her to flip his attack so effortlessly to turn accusations of inexperience into a larger, more damning critique of his own behavior. Whispers began spreading across the room. Some leaned toward each other, murmuring disbelief at what they were witnessing. A congresswoman, standing in the lion's den, not only holding her ground, but beginning to command the space. Crockett let the silence return, her words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. She had given just enough to shake him, just enough to make the audience question the judge's authority. And then she folded her hands, composed as ever, waiting for his next move. But Judge Alito was not about to surrender. His pride, his authority, his reputation, these were not things he relinquished easily. His eyes narrowed and the smirk returned. Thinner now, edged with something more dangerous. He was about to double down, and the audience braced themselves. Because while Crockett had landed a devastating counter, the judge was preparing to escalate. He had tasted the sting of her words, and now determined to reassert his dominance. He would unleash something far harsher, far more personal. The room seemed to lean forward, as though the very air anticipated the clash about to unfold. But the next move from Judge Alito would be his biggest mistake yet. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. After Jasmine Crockett's last verbal strike, a tangible shift had occurred. The audience no longer whispered doubt. They leaned forward, riveted. Even the cameras felt charged, capturing a moment that seemed destined to go viral. Judge Samuel Alito, once a picture of unshakable confidence, now rested his hands on the bench with a subtle tremor in his fingers. He had underestimated her before, and he wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. Alito's eyes glinted with renewed determination. He straightened in his chair, his voice calm but edged with menace. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, I admire your confidence, but let us see if it extends to real mastery. Explain to this court, without hesitation, the intricate balance between federal and state powers under the Commerce Clause, and do so while addressing at least 3 landmark cases that have shifted that balance. You have 3 minutes. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. This was no casual question. It was a meticulously designed intellectual trap. He had laid the perfect snare, complex, multi-layered, and almost guaranteed to expose her as unprepared or at least make her stumble. He leaned back, smirk creeping in once more, certain this time victory would be his. Jasmine Crockett's eyes narrowed not with fear, but focus. She lifted her chin, her posture regal, her composure unshaken. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed the room. Then she began, her voice clear and deliberate. Justice Alito, the Commerce Clause is often misunderstood as a license for unchecked federal control, she said, pacing her words with precision. Its true purpose is to maintain a cooperative balance, allowing states to flourish while preventing interstate conflicts that could harm the Union. Let's examine Gibbons v. Ogden, which first clarified Congress's power over interstate commerce. Then Wickard v. Filborn extended it carefully, but not without limits, considering local economic impact. Finally, United States v. Lopez reaffirmed that federal authority, while expansive, is not infinite and must respect the boundaries of state sovereignty. Gasps echoed lightly across the room. The audience wasn't just impressed, they were on the edge of their seats. Jasmine had not only answered the question, She had woven a narrative that reframed the Commerce Clause from a dry legal concept into a story of balance, fairness, and restraint. Alito's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth, perhaps to cut her off. But Crockett's next words struck like lightning. Yet here's the paradox. The federal government often invokes these precedents to expand its reach while claiming restraint. And the irony is, Justice Alito, some of the very cases you cite as foundations for judicial wisdom, demonstrate the dangers of overreach when interpretation divorces itself from principle. It's not just legal history. It's a cautionary tale for every court, every justice, every citizen. The murmurs in the gallery swelled into audible astonishment. Even senior clerks exchanged surprised glances, their pens hesitating mid-scribble. Jasmine had flipped the challenge on its head. The question designed to humiliate her had instead highlighted the flaws in the very logic her opponent had used to entrap her. She paused, letting the silence build tension, and then produced a thin file from her folder. And just to clarify this point, she said, laying it flat on the desk, here are excerpts from legal scholars who argue that some interpretations of the Commerce Clause have overstepped judicial intent. I'm quoting the experts, Justice Shett. They echo the same warnings you once cited yourself in earlier rulings. A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. Alito's face tightened, his eyes flicking toward the documents. He had thought he had set a trap. Instead, it had become a mirror reflecting his own precedents back at him. The audience noticed the flicker of uncertainty, the imperceptible twitch in a man whose confidence had always seemed unassailable. Crockett leaned forward, voice measured, calm, yet electrifying. The point is simple. Mastery isn't just recitation of cases. Mastery is understanding their application, limits, and consequences. And while you may have sought to corner me, Justice Alito, it is not my knowledge that is lacking, but your willingness to acknowledge how the law must serve the people, not personal prestige. Applause rippled across the gallery, soft at first, then swelling as recognition spread. A few reporters whispered into microphones, already imagining the headlines. Crockett turns Alito's trap into own trap. Young clerk even let out a low whistle. Even Alito himself leaned back, now silent. His gaze momentarily unfocused as the weight of her words sank in. And yet Jasmine Crockett was not finished. She closed her folder deliberately, but her eyes never left his. Justice, I welcome challenges. I thrive under scrutiny. But let us be honest. If an intellectual challenge's purpose is to humiliate rather than clarify, then the true failure lies not in the one answering it, but in the one attempting to trap with ego instead of principle. The courtroom erupted audible claps, whispered affirmations, shocked expressions all over. The tension had flipped entirely. Where Alito had sought to dominate, he now sat restrained by the spectacle of her intellect and composure. Crockett leaned back in her chair, serene yet undeniably commanding. Every eye in the room was on her, every camera capturing her poise, every whisper reverberating with a mix of shock and admiration. She had solved the unbeatable challenge with not just knowledge, but strategic brilliance. She had exposed Alito's arrogance, turned his intellectual trap into proof of his own overconfidence. And in doing so, she had cemented the courtroom's attention firmly on her. And just when everyone thought it was over, she revealed the final twist a moment. So precise, so utterly shocking, that it left the room suspended in disbelief. She gestured toward the papers she had placed on the desk, her calm voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Let this serve as a reminder. Even the most imposing challenges can be dismantled when preparation meets principle. And that is why truth, not ego, always prevails. A hushed silence fell over the room, heavier than before. Then slowly, whispers turned to murmurs of awe, and murmurs into applause that even the formalities of the courtroom could not fully contain. For the first time, the audience wasn't just watching history unfold, they were witnessing a master class in strategy, intellect, and courage. And in that moment, even Judge Alito Smirks couldn't hide the realization the challenge he had, thought unbeatable, had been utterly dismantled. The courtroom was electric, charged with an energy that seemed almost dangerous. Every spectator, every reporter, every clerk felt the shift. The balance of power had subtly, irrevocably tilted. Judge Samuel Alito, once the unshakable figure of authority, now radiated something far less controlled. The careful precision of his demeanor had begun to crack, a fracture widening with every heartbeat. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a taut, measured expression. And his eyes darted subtly, almost imperceptibly from Crockett to the audience. As if seeking reassurance from his allies in the gallery, Alito opened his mouth, then closed it again, the silence stretching like a taut wire.
Holly?
He spoke, but it was different this time. Gone was the measured, confident tone. It had been replaced by a hesitant, defensive cadence. "Congresswoman," he said, voice tight, perhaps, "we are focusing too much on minutia. Surely you can understand that legal interpretation involves nuance." The word landed flatly, without force, lacking conviction. Jasmine Crockett's eyes sharpened, her posture perfect, her voice calm but commanding as she leaned slightly forward. The courtroom audience seemed to lean with her, sensing the opportunity forming in real time. "Nuance, Justice Alito, is precisely why clarity matters," she replied. "You claim nuance, yet your previous statements attempted to trap me with complexity rather than debate. The goal wasn't understanding, it was spectacle. The difference between performance and principle, justice, is exactly what I just demonstrated." The subtle shake in Alito's hand betrayed him. He tapped his pen nervously against the bench. The camera caught it. The courtroom noticed. Where once there had been unwavering authority, now there was uncertainty. Alito tried another tactic deflection. "Congresswoman, one could argue that perhaps your approach is theatrical. Perhaps it distracts from the central issues." Jasmine's gaze swept across the room, locking on individual audience members, connecting directly with their attention. Her voice rose with both precision and weight. "The central issue, justice, isn't whether I perform theatrically," she said. "The central issue is whether the law serves the people. Your attempts to redirect attention, to paint principle as performance, are exactly what the public is tired of seeing. Accountability is not entertainment, but it seems spectacle is easier for some to wield than responsibility." A wave of murmurs passed through the chamber. Porters were scribbling furiously, some whispering excitedly about how the tables had turned. A few jurists in the gallery nodded subtly, recognizing the strength of her point. Even elite clerks exchanged glances, their fingers pausing mid-note. Alito's composure faltered further. He shifted in his seat, glancing toward the side, and tried to regain dominance with a dismissive tone. "Congresswoman, you speak broadly. ... But can you provide specifics? Can you cite where my reasoning has been inconsistent? It was a dangerous misstep." Jasmine Crockett's eyes narrowed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played across her lips, not arrogance, but the quiet certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life, of course. She said softly, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering the strike. "In your dissent on Case X, you argued one standard for executive authority. Yet in Case Y, you applied a completely different standard for the same type of executive action. Context shifted, you claim, but principle remained inconsistent. And then there was your opinion in Case Z, where procedural nuances seemed secondary to personal preference. I do not accuse you lightly. Justice, these are public records, accessible to every citizen, and they reveal a pattern, not just of intellectual reasoning, but of selective interpretation." Gasps scattered across the room. The audience leaned forward, collectively realizing that the hero of this moment was not just holding her ground, she was exposing cracks in the very foundation of the opponent's authority. Alito's pen dropped from his fingers, his jaw tightened. He cleared his throat, searching for an escape. But his options were shrinking. Jasmine pressed her advantage, speaking directly to the courtroom now, bypassing the judge entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen what accountability looks like. You've witnessed someone attempting to dominate through intimidation and theatrics, only to be met with reason, preparation, and principle. This isn't about political theater, it's about integrity. And integrity, unlike smirks and bravado, does not bend under pressure, it stands, unwavering." Applause fluttered quietly at first, then grew louder, hesitant yet mounting. Some rose to their feet, eyes wide. Social media notifications had probably exploded by now, cameras and smartphones capturing every angle of the spectacle. Even the reporters in the back whispered to one another, "She is dismantling him piece by piece." Alito tried to interject, his voice now brittle with frustration, but Crockett cut him off with subtle authority. "Justice, I appreciate your perspective truly. But this isn't about winning. This is about demonstrating that justice cannot be wielded as a weapon. Every misstep, every inconsistency becomes an opportunity not for humiliation but for transparency. And that is why the people, the public, and this courtroom are watching so closely. They see the truth, not just the words." The gallery erupted. Whispers had grown into murmurs, murmurs into applause, applause into a wave of acknowledgement. Judges, clerks, and even visiting legal scholars exchanged nods. They were witnesses to a courtroom shift so profound that it would be analyzed for months to come. Alito's shoulders slumped fractionally, a gesture small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, but unmistakable to anyone observing closely. The man who had intended to dominate now seemed trapped by the very arena he had hoped to command. His attempts to steer the conversation, to salvage authority, had only emphasized his unraveling. Jasmine seized the moment with surgical precision. She leaned forward, voice calm but irresistible in its intensity. "And let this be a lesson. Authority without accountability is fragile. Confidence without integrity is hollow. You may have attempted to intimidate me into submission, Justice Alito, but the court, the public, and history itself will remember how truth prevailed over ego." The audience reacted viscerally. Whispers of admiration filled the chamber.
Phones.
Snapped photos, journalists murmured into microphones, and the gallery's body language shifted unmistakably in her favor. The momentum had fully swung. Even Alito's attempts at composure couldn't hide it anymore.
Oh.
The audience saw a man visibly strained under pressure, fumbling for justification. Jasmine Crockett exuded clarity, power, and control. Every word she spoke reinforced the reality that she was no longer simply defending her arguments, she was defining the narrative of the courtroom itself, and as the session drew toward a tense pause, Jasmine's eyes swept the room one last time. Calm, collected, commanding, she left the implicit challenge lingering in the air. Every journalist, every clerk, every member of the audience knew the final showdown had not yet arrived. The camera lingered on Alito's tight jawline,
Ow!
Eyes flickering nervously to the floor and back, and then on Jasmine's serene composure, a visual testament to her mastery of the room. The tension was palpable, hanging like a thundercloud, ready to release its storm. And just as the audience caught their breath, a collective realization hit them. The final moment of truth was still to come. The courtroom was a furnace of tension. Every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett, every camera zoomed in, every whisper hanging in the air. Judge Samuel Alito, once the unshakable titan of authority, now sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edges of the bench as if to anchor himself against the storm Jasmine had unleashed. He had tried intellectual traps, feints of intimidation and public embarrassment. Yet each had bounced back onto him like a mirror reflecting his own missteps. Now, in a desperate attempt to reclaim dominance, Alito leaned forward, eyes narrowing, a dangerous glint of mockery creeping back into his gaze. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, voice forced into a sardonic edge. "We could spend all day on interpretations, historical footnotes, and abstract principles, but at the end of the day, isn't this all just theatrics? Performance? For the cameras, rather than a pursuit of justice?" The words were designed to sting, to provoke doubt, to make her seem shallow. His smirk returned, slightly tighter, like a trap closing. He was attempting emotional manipulation, trying to frame her as someone seeking attention rather than advancing law. Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. She sat upright, her presence commanding. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, then locked on Alito. And for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. She didn't just respond. She radiated authority, intellect, and moral certainty that demanded attention. "Justice Alito," she began, voice steady, resonant, and precise. "This isn't a performance. This is accountability. The people, the law, and history are watching. And history remembers not those who smirked in their comfort zones, but those who upheld principle in the face of hubris." Alito's smirk faltered slightly. His hands twitched, betraying the tension he tried to mask. He attempted another jab, more desperate this time. "Principle. You speak as if you hold the moral high ground. But tell me, Congresswoman, is your approach always so? Confrontational? Or is that just a tactic to gain public favor?" The courtroom audience leaned in. Even subtle movements of heads, shifting in their seats, signaled the growing tide of support for Jasmine. The smirk that Alito thought projected power now seemed almost cartoonish, mask slipping. Jasmine's smile was slight, not condescending, but knowing. She leaned forward, letting the moment stretch, before dropping the words that would strike with precision. "Confrontation," she said softly, "is not my tool. It is a reflection of necessity. When authority dismisses accountability, when smirks replace substance, when privilege is wielded as a shield, confrontation becomes the language of truth. I am not here for applause, Justice Alito. I am here for clarity, for justice, and for the record. And the record speaks clearly. Actions, words, and rulings matter. They are scrutinized, remembered, and judged." A hush fell over the courtroom. Whispers turned into quiet nods, heads tilting, pens pausing mid-note. The air itself seemed charged, waiting for the final strike. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a series of document citations, rulings, and historical references. She laid them flat on the bench in front of Alito, sliding them gently, deliberately, almost ceremoniously. "These," she continued, her voice rising just enough to command every ear, "are not cherry-picked notes or rhetoric. These are documented instances where judicial overreach, inconsistent reasoning, and ego-driven decisions undermined both principle and public trust. Each one of these examples comes from public records, prior rulings, and yes, even your own citations. They prove a pattern. And patterns, justice, are what history remembers." The courtroom gasped audibly. The gallery murmured, whispers building into audible recognition. Reporters' pens scribbled furiously. Even the seasoned clerks exchanged stunned glances. Alito's eyes widened imperceptibly, his hands frozen mid-gesture. He had attempted mockery, deflection, intimidation, but she had turned every tactic against him, exposing both his logic and his pride. Jasmine leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "The truth is simple. Accountability is not selective. Authority is not immune to scrutiny. And history will not forgive those who attempt to cloak ego in robes of unchallenged power." She paused. The silence was deafening. Then, in a voice that resonated across the chamber like a gavel strike, she delivered the ultimate blow. "Justice Alito, your smirk may have been meant to intimidate. But intimidation does not equal authority. Performance does not equal principle. Ego does not equal truth. In this courtroom today, the record speaks louder than any smirk, and the record is crystal clear." The effect was instantaneous. The audience erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then overwhelming. Standing ovations spread through the gallery as journalists and clerks alike rose to their feet. Camera flashes popped, capturing the shock, awe, and exhilaration in real time. The momentum had swung completely. Alito, for the first time in memory, sat stunned. His lips parted slightly, no words emerging. He had no counter, no defense, no retort. The power he had attempted to wield had evaporated under the precision, clarity, and undeniable truth of Crockett's delivery. The courtroom watched enrapt. Silence as the man who had tried to dominate through smirks, intimidation, and clever deflection was left utterly speechless. And yet, Jasmine did not linger in triumph. She allowed the silence to stretch, letting the audience feel the gravity of what had just occurred. Every eye remained on her, every camera fixed, every whispered breath a part of the tension. Then, she leaned back, serene but commanding voice, calm yet echoing in every corner of the room. "This," she said, gesturing slightly to the papers, "is how truth prevails. Not through theatrics, not through ego, but through preparation, principle, an unwavering commitment to accountability." The standing ovation intensified. Even reporters who had come expecting controversy found themselves caught in admiration. Social media feeds would later explode with clips of her calm dominance. Dissected line by line, headline after headline, Crockett leaves Alito speechless in courtroom showdown. And just when the final echoes of applause seemed to settle, Jasmine's eyes swept the courtroom, her composure unbroken, her gaze unwavering. Everyone knew the opponent had been humiliated beyond repair. The cameras captured it, the gallery witnessed it, history recorded it, and then, with a quiet intensity, that left the room holding its collective breath. The narrator's voice would later reveal, and that's when the real shock came next. The courtroom had barely begun to settle from the storm Jasmine Crockett had unleashed. But the echoes of applause and murmurs of astonishment lingered like electric charge in the air. Judge Samuel Alito, once a towering figure of unyielding authority, now sat quietly, his posture rigid but subdued. He had attempted mockery, intimidation, and intellectual traps, yet each had rebounded, leaving him visibly diminished. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. For a moment, Alito's gaze met Crockett's across the bench, and the weight of acknowledgement flickered in his eyes. He did not rise to argue further. He did not attempt a final jab. Instead, he collected his papers slowly, the courtroom watching in tense anticipation, and left the bench. There was no dramatic exit, no verbal admission, just the quiet, unmistakable fade of influence. The kind that history remembers longer than the loudest confrontation. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Every journalist, clerk, and gallery visitor knew that they had just witnessed the end of a confrontation, not merely about legal interpretation, but about accountability, intellect, and the courage to stand against ego when it masquerades as authority. JasmineCrockett.com, but unwavering, rose from her seat, scanning the courtroom one final time. Her presence commanded attention, her composure radiated authority, and her eyes held a depth that was equal parts intellect and empathy. She spoke. Not to a single judge, but to the room, to the country, and in that viral moment, to a nation. Watching through cameras and screens, in the end, she said, voice steady and resonant, intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. This courtroom today is proof not only that knowledge and preparation matter, but that integrity and courage are forces no smirk or attempt at dominance can suppress. The audience stirred again, quietly at first, then louder as they absorbed the weight of her words. Some nodded, some whispered agreements, and cameras captured each subtle reaction, astonishment, admiration, and validation. The tension that had gripped the room transformed into respect. Collective acknowledgement of her triumph and composure. Jasmine's words turned outward now, reaching beyond the walls of the courthouse, touching the heart of every citizen who believed in fairness, justice, and accountability. Let this moment remind us, she continued, that power without principle is fragile. That ego can never replace effort. That those who attempt to humiliate or intimidate must always be measured not by their confidence, but by the clarity and consistency of their reasoning. Her gaze softened slightly, not in concession, but in shared humanity. And let us remember this in our own lives, when faced with unfair criticism, impossible challenges, or attempts to diminish our efforts. We must stand firm, prepared and guided by our values. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is, quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. And those moments define us more than any fleeting victory of intimidation ever could. The murmurs grew into applause once more, the kind that is heartfelt, unrestrained, and entirely earned. Phones and cameras captured the moment for a worldwide audience, already trending on social media. Clips of Jasmine's calm dominance and eloquent delivery were shared with headlines that emphasized clarity over chaos, principle over performance. She leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice to carry the weight of an intimate truth. Not be disheartened by attempts to silence or humiliate you. Knowledge, preparation, and principle will outlast bluster and bravado. Stand firm in your convictions. Speak your truth. Let integrity be your voice when others attempt to dominate with ego alone. And turning fully to the cameras, her words became both challenge and call to action. Do you think justice was served today? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for truth, share this video widely. Hold the powerful accountable. Remember that moments like this are not just lessons in law, they are lessons in courage, resilience, and the enduring strength of intellect over arrogance. The room erupted once more, this time in sustained applause. Some stood, some clapped, some recorded every detail for history. And even Alito's clerks exchanged glances of awe, their respect for her composure undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had not merely survived a courtroom gauntlet, she had transformed it into a masterclass of strategy, principle, and emotional intelligence. Finally, with the gallery buzzing, cameras flashing, and journalists framing their stories, Jasmine took a step back. Her face remained calm, her eyes thoughtful yet resolute. She allowed the room to breathe in the aftermath of her triumph, and as the final echo of applause settled, she offered a quiet, powerful reminder that would resonate long after the camera stopped rolling. Remember, this truth does not bend. For arrogance, courage does not bow to intimidation, and integrity always rises to meet the moment. The courtroom and the nation watching understood immediately. The fight was over. The lesson was clear, and the impact would be unforgettable.